After World War II, a new eugenics was resurrected out of the bones and ashes of the old eugenics. The eugenics movement has been at the forefront to establish a new scientific racism that justifies oppression and exploitation and racism.
In fact, racism is inseparable from the roots of psychiatry.
The entire history of psychiatry, beginning with scientific conclusions that were made in the 1830s, was an effort to prove the intellectual inferiority of African Americans.
Benjamin Rush is the father of modern psychiatry. And he is the one that gave us the term nigritude. He said that all blacks have inherited this disease, and this particular disease, it caused them to be inferior. In addition to that, it was the reason why it was very important that blacks remain segregated and separate from whites so that whites did not inherit this disease.
Asserting that negritude was a form of leprosy, Rush justified segregation as a medical necessity, and that became an argument to continue slavery.
The fact that you have brutalized a whole group of people had nothing to do with that. It had everything to do with some genetic link, and that basically you were just a diseased person. So when a slave master wanted to get rid of a recalcitrant slave, they could just say, oh, well, they're suffering from this disease.
Drapetomania, that is the name of the mental disorder that was contrived by Samuel Cartwright, who said that blacks have a mental disorder if they had a desire to run away from slavery.
Running away became such a common problem that psychiatrists attempted to give that a disease. He says, but that's a cure for that. And the question was, well, what's the cure for that? Frequent whippings, frequent whippings. You'd be surprised how that disease clears up when the lash is put in place of their excuses.
After slavery was abolished, psychiatric racism not only persisted, it intensified. The American Journal of Psychiatry officially proclaimed that Negroes, as descendants of savages and cannibals, were ill-prepared for higher civilization, while their pseudo-science eugenics stepped up its racist activities.
There is a clear and long and intimate connection between the eugenics movement and the Ku Klux Klan. Harry Laughlin, who was the Carnegie Institution's director of the Eugenics Record Office, had close relationship to the Ku Klux Klan through the publication of a book called White America, which was written by a major Klan leader. So Laughlin wrote a glowing review of the book in the Eugenics News. And at the same time, you have the Ku Klux Klan using eugenics to justify their racist goals.
But psychiatric racism wasn't exclusively American. Some of the worst abuses of the 20th century occurred in South Africa, where the government adopted the same racist theories and practices used by Hitler. This was no coincidence. The Prime Minister had studied eugenics as a psychology student in Nazi-influenced Germany in the 1920s.
Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd is regarded as the architect of apartheid. He saw South Africa as a divided state with whites, blacks and brown people living in totally separate areas, with black people having no rights whatsoever.
With apartheid in place, psychiatrists established mental hospitals throughout the country that were in fact nothing more than slave labor camps.
These places operated under a private company by the name of Smith, Mitchell and Company. They were saving money through the cheap accommodation for psychiatric patients while making massive fortune out of money that Parliament had appropriated for medication. So it was a corrupt system.
When this operation was finally exposed, it was discovered that 67,000 prisoners had perished, while at the same time, psychiatrists had collected $117 million in funding from the South African government. The World Health Organization issued a report declaring that psychiatry cultivated racism and that apartheid did have a parallel in the ownership and trading of slaves. In 1971, in the United States, psychiatrist Louis Jolly West continued psychiatry's legacy of racism, hatching a secret aversion therapy experiment called the Violence Center. His government-funded plan: implant electrodes in the brains of African American and Hispanic males to shock them should they exhibit any violent behavior. And if that didn't work, chemically castrate them with drugs. When West's racist proposal met with public outrage, the plan was quickly shelved. Though psychiatry's unrelenting racist theories were blunted, they were not stopped. In 1994, psychologist Richard Herrnstein co-authored The Bell Curve, claiming to prove that blacks were genetically disabled and therefore inferior to whites.
The Bell Curve really argues a very old eugenics idea. It argues that people are born with different kinds of intellectual abilities, that these are inborn pretty much at birth. It goes back to the notion that somehow black people are genetically and biologically inferior to white people as a way to justify what was really its programs of social racism and social sexism. And you see that kind of thinking going on in public school testing and IQ testing and educational testing and tracking.
And this new tool fit into that old mold. It was a new tool that could prove the intellectual inferiority of African Americans.
The psychiatric profession has done great damage, certainly in the past, and far too many in the present too, to subvert democracy and perpetuate racial stereotypes, even more, deep racism in society.
We have to battle against this continual misinformation, disinformation, pseudoscience. It can be repackaged in whatever form or format it is. But if it is based solely upon the color of one's skin and then is the merit of that human being, I just reject it.
And so today, the flame of hatred continues to burn, fueled by pseudo-scientific lies. This is the heritage of psychiatry, as a justification for racism and as a pretext for political repression.
Быть верными коммунистическим идеалам, убежденно, с революционной настойчивостью, претворять в жизнь ленинский завет, учиться коммунизму, трудиться самоотверженно, по-коммунистически, всей жизнью своей, утверждать на земле дело Ленина, дело партии. Клянемся!
The Soviet regime demanded absolute loyalty. Those who did not toe the party line were considered dissidents and labeled enemies of the state. With no more than a whisper to the secret police, they would vanish into one of these special psychiatric hospitals. Despite the risks, these so-called dissidents put their ideas of freedom into action.
Я вел жизнь тайную, конспиративную. Никто не знал, что я это делаю. У меня была маленькая подпольная типография, и я стал делать листовки.
While others considered themselves loyal Soviet citizens.
Я, например, считал, и то уверенно считал, что я один из лучших советских людей. Когда уже даже меня арестовали и написали особо опасный государственный преступ, я рассмеялся. Я при нем, при этом же самом нынешнем генерале, рассмеялся. А он меня вызывает психиатра на утро.
According to Soviet psychiatrists, they all suffered from inflexibility of convictions, a symptom of a new disorder, sluggish schizophrenia.
Вот когда добьешься, тогда я заем.
Так до конца пей.
Я буду с ним. Ребята, не заставьте его.
Давай пей, брат.
Like their counterparts in other countries, the Soviet psychiatrists prescribed powerful drugs to cure their patients.
Они никогда их с удовольствием не принимают. И находят пути их не принимать. Мы обязаны просмотреть прием лекарств, потому что больные лекарства дошли до больного. Вот они где-то уже, как говорится, в горле проглатывают, все, ротовая полость чистая. И потом вот такие делают какие-то движения, отрыгивают.
Врач на обходе говорит: как себя чувствуете, Петр Петрович? Я говорю: послушайте, вот, а там, когда 5 кубиков галоперидола, то надо, например, слюна до полу, там перекошенность вся, значит, одни мышцы растягиваются, другие сокращаются, совершенно ужасные позы, лицо все ужасное, на душе страшно просто. Я человека, вот самое главное, описать это состояние невозможно.
Санитары совершенно безнаказанно могли избивать. По любому поводу. Или вообще без повода. Вот, например, санитар открывает дверь, и вдруг, если тут ты оказался, например, в проеме двери. И вот этого достаточно было, чтобы, скажем, получить удар. Если больной, скажем, оказывал сопротивление при избиении, то его могли привязать, и привязывали, и уже избивали, и продолжали избивать уже привязанного.
Проходит, допустим, год-два, там выписывают убийц, выписывают насильников. Михаил, ты бы лучше убил бы кого-нибудь, мне бы легче было тебя отсюда вытолкнуть. Это было, вот, растало такое чувство безысходности.
From 1967 to 1987, the Soviet government arrested over 2 million people who, for political reasons, were diagnosed as mentally sick and were forced to undergo psychiatric treatment. Even today, psychiatry remains the coercive tool of choice for governments throughout the world.
What we've learned is that in Gitmo or Guantanamo Bay, that we had teams of healthcare professionals called the biscuit teams, behavioral scientists, psychologists, working with the military to advise them on how far you could push a prisoner. There are abuses that have been documented around the world. We have healthcare professionals who have committed potentially acts of treason within their medical ethics. And there's nobody supervising that. There's nobody making them stand accountable to their medical ethics.
But psychiatrists have never reserved physical and mental torture exclusively for political prisoners. Throughout history, they have repackaged it and sold it to the public as therapy. Beginning in the 1920s, psychiatrists embraced a new group of procedures that claimed to work by creating intentional damage to the brain.
Manfred Sokal had this notion that he could kill just the bad brain cells, that somehow we have good brain cells, we have bad brain cells. So if you give people enough insulin, you kill those bad brain cells, and if the person survived this epilepsy, they would be better off for it.
Despite convulsions that caused severe spinal cord injuries in 40% of the patients, Sokal pointed to their childlike state and declared his treatment a success. Hospitals built insulin wards, and coma therapy became big business. Not to be outdone, Ladislaus von Meduna of Hungary believed he could drive out mental illness by inducing brain-damaging seizures with a drug called metrazole.
He noticed his epileptics had no mental health problems, and his mental health patients, his psychiatric patients, seemed to have no epilepsy, and so he thought doing one would obviate the other.
The theory was that epilepsy and schizophrenia couldn't coexist in the same brain, and that if epilepsy was induced, that a seizure was caused, it would, quote, drive out the schizophrenia. There's no scientific basis for this whatsoever.
Metrazole was fast and lucrative. In a morning, a single psychiatrist could chemically shock 50 patients into a docile and manageable state. By 1939, metrazole was so popular with psychiatrists and staff, it was used in 70% of American hospitals and in almost every other country in the world. The financial success of insulin and metrazole sparked the development of an even more profitable method of inducing brain-damaging convulsions.
How is electric shock therapy done? We use these electrodes. We place them on the patient's head like this, and then by means of this machine, we pass a controlled electric current through the brain, just for a fraction of a second. The patient doesn't feel it.
The story behind this miracle cure began in a Roman slaughterhouse.
In Italy, in 1938, two Italian psychiatrists decided to observe that before slaughtering pigs, in order to make the pigs more docile, they would apply electrodes to their temples that were hooked up to wall current, and that this stunned the pigs, but it didn't kill them, and they could then slaughter them. Well, this gave them the encouragement to try inducing convulsions with electricity.
We would see teeth falling out, broken spines, bones knocked out of joint, broken bones, and people even getting internal organ damage from being restrained while they were having these uncontrolled writhing seizures, convulsions.
Many patients have been returned to their homes and jobs who might still be here if it were not for this helpful form of treatment.
Having successfully sold brain damage as a cure, psychiatrists searched for even more precise ways of targeting the brain. This was jump-started in 1848 when an explosion blew a steel rod straight through the head of Vermont railway worker Phineas Gage. While Gage survived, his personality was dramatically altered. 70 years later, Portuguese neurologist Igaz Moniz would try to obtain a similar result by drilling into a patient's skull and squirting pure alcohol directly into the brain, killing the tissue of the frontal lobes. Moniz called this new procedure a lobotomy. Dr. Walter J. Freeman would become lobotomy's most infamous practitioner. He discovered he could do it faster without having to drill through the skull.
There was no anesthesia, and he would just lift up the eye and stick nothing more than an ice pick right into the brain, right under the orbital bone, and then just rake the thing back and forth until he was satisfied that he had caused enough disruption of brain tissue, and then pull it out.
Freeman traveled the country in his lobotomobile, hacking apart his patients' brains on stage, or sometimes right there in the vehicle.
And he would pull up and offer lobotomies to people, get referrals from the local doctors, or sometimes people didn't even go through doctors. They'd go right to the lobotomobile, and he would just do the brain-damaging procedure right there.
By the time his surgical privileges were revoked after his last patient died on the operating table, Freeman had performed or supervised over 3,500 lobotomies, more than 25% of which, by his own admission, left his patients in a vegetative state.
They lobotomized 1 million people in the 40s and the 50s and beginning of the 60s until they came to the conclusion that this was a destructive treatment.
But though the stories of miraculous cures were soon exposed as brain-damaging frauds, psychiatrists kept one step ahead, inventing new forms of psychosurgery, passed off as medical advances.
I completely shuddered from head to toe. And that's what I heard in my head when he drilled something in my brain.
Northwest, actually, of the centre home.
I'm sorry I had to do that.
Yeah, why did you have to do that?
I went, oh, funny, and
Did
my
you?
head all shook inside.
Oh dear.
Oh, my head shook inside.
Yes, all right.
Everything shook, my eyes, everything, my teeth.
Oh, that's well.
That was grievous bodily harm done to my brain. And nobody has the right anyway to play God with somebody's brain.
The whole operation took about 8.5 hours, and they kept me awake for every second of it. And I remember every second of it. And I still remember it to this day because I have this operation every day of my life. Whether I like it or not, I have it.
Psychiatrists still tout the benefits of lobotomy, a treatment that earns them $31 million annually. But in the wake of lobotomy's tarnished reputation, psychiatrists were quick to push electroshock back into the spotlight. Renaming it electroconvulsive therapy, they now give patients anesthetics to squash their screams and paralyzing agents to avoid watching the writhing of agony.
The main misconception that people have about ECT is that it's new and improved. The new and improved refers strictly to these cosmetic improvements because, in fact, they make it easier on the witnesses. The person isn't shaking all over the table. They're paralyzed now. It isn't new, it isn't improved, it is worse.
Every 10 years or so, there tends to be, first of all, a denial that it causes any harm. Secondly, an acknowledgement that it might have caused harm, but here's a whole new approach, and now this one is blameless, without any research to back it up.
The ECT machine can produce anywhere from 50 to 400 volts. It's the kind of energy that we use for industrial machinery that might be in a steel mill or a printing press, some large piece of machinery. It's an extraordinary amount of energy, and it causes a great deal of damage.
And while stories of prisoners physically mistreated with electroshock are well publicized, the amount of electricity doled out by psychiatrists for ECT is up to 33 times greater. And that damage is most often targeted at the most vulnerable. 2/3 of those who receive electroshock are women. Given such diagnoses as premenstrual syndrome, menopausal disorder, or postpartum depression. Half of electroshock patients are elderly. Once they become eligible for government health care at age 65, 360% more American seniors receive ECT than at age 64. And what does this all add up to? 40,000 dead, and countless others so brain damaged they have no hope of ever recovering a normal life. For a total of $12 worth of electricity, psychiatrists in the United States alone rake in $5 billion. But the next miracle cure psychiatrists added to their arsenal made them more money than ever before. For it was faster, cheaper, and could turn every man, woman, and child into a patient for life. By the early 1950s, psychiatrists discovered their next miracle cure. A chemical originally designed to kill parasites in pigs, their new discovery hindered brain function in much the same way as shoving an ice pick into the eye socket. It was an old treatment in a new disguise.
With the advent of these new tranquilizing drugs, it seems not too much to say that we're on the verge of an entirely new era in the treatment of mental illness.
Dubbing it a chemical lobotomy, Canadian psychiatrist Heinz Lehmann described Thorazine as a simple, easy-to-take pill with the same effects as psychosurgery, but without the mess.
Thorazine provided psychiatry with the entry into mainstream medicine. It had its magic bullet. If I'm a psychiatrist and I have to spend an hour talking to someone in psychotherapy, there's only so much I can charge for that hour. But if I can come in, give you a pill, and send you back out in 15 minutes or 10 minutes, that's a much more efficient use of my time monetarily.
What psychiatrists didn't tell the public was that Thorazine caused a crippling neurological condition known as tardive dyskinesia.
And that's a neurological syndrome where you have muscle twitches, abnormal jerks, which are uncontrolled, and they either last for a long time or sometimes they're permanent. So that's very clear, very well recognized, long-term or permanent brain damage from these medications.
Mr. Blount has virtually no signs of his original illness now. The signs that the movements of his mouth are completely side effects of the drugs that he was on for 20 years. Mr. Blount is quite rational. He understands what's going on. And if you're patient, he can carry on a very rational conversation with you.
Even when you remove the drug, it may still remain. It means you have caused a permanent disabling of the brain. In the late 50s, you get the first signs of it, people starting to worry about it. But it's not until the late 70s that psychiatrists start warning their patients about it, 20 years.
Thorazine's manufacturer, SmithKline French, had good reason to keep a lid on the bad news. In the first year alone, SKF saw a 3,000% return on their original investment. With the public and the press kept in the dark about the severe and disabling side effects, prominent doctors and psychiatrists met in Puerto Rico to lay the groundwork for the expansion of psychiatric drugs far into the future. Psychiatrist Dr. Nathan Klein wrote this in the conference's final report.
The present breadth of drug use may be almost trivial when we compare it to the possible number of chemical substances that will be available for the control of selective aspects of man's life in the year 2000.
Dr. Klein spearheaded a movement flooding new psychiatric wonder drugs onto the global marketplace, backed by a massive publicity machine, spending hundreds of millions of dollars. Psychiatry was now an industry of drug pushers. By 1970, the American Psychiatric Association was so dependent on drug company money that 30% of its annual budget came from pharmaceutical advertisements in its official journals.
So we had money flowing to trade organizations, we had money flowing to the doctors, and to their journals. Well, we all know that that is going to influence how they think.
The majority of National Institute of Mental Health and National Institute of Health scientists are getting more money from drug companies on the side than their tax-based salary.
With so much money to be made, all psychiatrists needed was a scientific theory to justify it. Their solution? An official report declaring that all mental problems derive from a so-called chemical imbalance in the brain, requiring drugs to correct.
This chemical imbalance is one of the greatest fallacies ever foisted upon patients and the public. There is no chemical test to show an imbalance related to any psychiatric disease, whether it's depression, anxiety, what have you.
The chemical imbalance is for the benefit of the psychiatrist. It has to be there so that psychiatrists can treat it.
But fraudulent chemical imbalance theories could not hide the mounting evidence of common and terrifying side effects, such as akathisia.
Akathisia is like an extreme inner nervous agitation. People describe it as wanting to crawl out of their own skins. And this happens with great frequency, and it is absolutely, totally well understood to be associated with suicide and violence and homicide.
After years of these reported side effects and cases upon cases of violence, self-mutilation, and death, in 1991, health experts, legislators, and the public finally forced the FDA to order an investigation.
I know with absolute certainty that if Charles had any idea of the side effects of Prozac, he would never have taken it.
I had two sons, David Lee, age 8, Billy 16, a wife 20 years old, gone. I'll tell you why. After being on Prozac for 21 days, my wife shot and killed both of these two boys right here. She turned the gun to herself and shot herself twice.
I took the 9mm automatic, sat down on the bed and put the gun to my head. And I blew a 4-inch hole out the back of my arm instead of my head. Thank God I was a lousy shot. Had someone looked further into Prozac, steps could have been taken to avoid it.
What was supposed to be an unbiased hearing was a panel of psychiatrists, the vast majority with personal financial ties to pharmaceutical companies.
They basically couldn't find an expert, a doctor, a psychiatrist, at a leading medical school who basically in some way or another didn't have a consulting agreement, hadn't taken money from the pharmaceutical companies.
I do not find from the evidence today that there is credible evidence to support a conclusion that antidepressant drugs cause the emergence and or the intensification of suicidality and or other violent behaviors.
500 deaths, 33 murder cases, and over 20,000 adverse side effects. Would you like to tell me why this drug is still on the market?
Is there an alliance, an unholy alliance between the psychiatric community, the pharmaceutical industry, and the FDA? And the answer is yes.
This unholy alliance became all too apparent in 1997, when pharmaceutical companies persuaded the FDA to allow them to advertise directly to the public, with psychiatrists providing medical endorsement